Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you all. I am pleased to be with you today. I am Al-Anud Al-Hosani from Trends Research and Advisory. I will be introducing this important symposium organized by the Middle East Center at the University of Pennsylvania and Trends Research and Advisory, a research center based in Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates. It is an honor to start today's event with a speech from Dr. John Ghazvanian, Executive Director of the Middle East Center.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's absolutely delightful to see all of you here. I will be extremely brief because I know you haven't come to hear me. You've come to hear all the fascinating conversations that we're going to be having today about the changing Middle East and all of the international implications and prospects for regional stability. You have an extraordinary range of experts and speakers lined up. I want to begin by saying a very special thank you and welcome to all of our guests from the United Arab Emirates here today. It is so exciting to finally see your faces here in person after all the conversations we've been having for a number of months now. For those of you who have joined us from Penn and the Philadelphia community, I should probably give you a little bit of background into how this event came about. This would not have happened without our extraordinary, talented, agile, and brilliant Assistant Director, Ibrahim Bakri, who has been really the linchpin behind all of this. We owe him a great deal of gratitude for helping to bring together our two organizations. I also want to take the moment here to acknowledge our distinguished visitor, Dr. Mohammed Al-Ali, whose vision and leadership in bringing the Trends Research and Advisory to the point that it has reached, all the successes that we've witnessed in recent years. And it is such a thrill and honor for us to be able to begin what we hope will be a more enduring, meaningful, and long-lasting partnership and friendship, really, between the Middle East Center at the University of Pennsylvania and Trends Research and Advisory. We've been having informal conversations for a number of months. We have more exciting things to unveil in the coming months, inshallah. We, of course, deal with all kinds of bureaucratic and administrative challenges that mean things move more slowly than we would like them to move. But we at the Middle East Center are committed to making sure things move as rapidly as possible so that we can do more events like this, more exchanges of scholars, more dialogues, more conversations between the exciting and dynamic speakers and teams that we will be hearing from today. Without any further ado, I want to take a moment to hand back to Al-Anud, who will be your MC for today's festivities. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. John. And now, let me welcome Dr. Mohammed Al-Ali, CEO of Trends Research and Advisory, to give the opening remarks in Arabic to today's symposium. Dr. Mohammed, the stage is yours.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السيدات والسادة أيها الحضور الكريم، يسعدني وفريق عملي في ترندز للبحوث والاستشارات أن أكون معكم اليوم في هذا المركز البحثي النشيط وهذه الجامعة العريقة جامعة بنسلفانيا، التي نحرص على تعزيز التعاون البحثي والمعرفي معها لخدمة قضايا التنمية والسلام والازدهار في منطقة الشرق الأوسط وعبر العالم. وقد كانت لنا بالفعل تجربة تعاون ثرية مع برنامج مراكز الأبحاث والمجتمعات المدنية التابع لمعهد لاودر بجامعة بنسلفانيا الأمريكية، حيث نظمنا معا في يوليو 2021 في دبي منتدى مستقبل المواهب الشبابية في المراكز البحثية، والذي ناقش تقييم الاستراتيجيات الفعالة التي يمكن أن تساعد مراكز الفكر في تحديد الجيل القادم من الباحثين وقادة الفكر ورعايتهم. وهنا اسمحوا لي أن أعبر مرة أخرى عن عميق عزائي ومواساتي في الفقيد والصديق الدكتور جون ماغان، رئيس البرنامج السابق، الذي صدمنا موته المفاجئ في الوقت الذي كنا نعمل فيه معا على إنجاز فعالية أخرى مهمة لجميع مراكز الفكر وتعزيز دورها في خدمة المجتمعات وصناع القرار. وأقدم عزائي مجددا لأسرته الصغيرة ولأسرة جامعة بنسلفانيا. ويمثل هذا المؤتمر الذي نعقده اليوم مع مركز الشرق الأوسط في جامعة بنسلفانيا العريقة استمرارا لهذا التعاون الذي نحرص على تعزيزه مستقبلا. مرة أخرى أرحب بكم وأترك المجال لاستكمال فعاليات هذه الندوة. شكرا جزيلا.
Shukran. Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. And now, allow me to give the floor to Ali Al-Janibi, Head of Strategic Communications at Trends Research and Advisory, to deliver the welcoming remarks at this event on behalf of Dr. Mohammed Al-Ali, CEO of Trends. Alia?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Alia Al-Junaybi, and I'm honored on behalf of Dr. Mohammed Al-Ali, the CEO of Trends Research and Advisory, to welcome you all at this very important symposium entitled The Changing of Middle East, International Implications and Prospects for Regional Stability, organized by Trends and the Middle East Center at the University of Pennsylvania. First of all, I would like to express my delight in being part of the first joint resulting from the partnership between Trends Research and Advisory and the Middle East Center at the University of Pennsylvania. This cooperation is sure to expand in the future to serve our shared research objectives, including most notably finding ways to enhance sustainable regional security in the Middle East. The Middle East has seen major transformations in the last decade, which have impacted regional security and stability, as well as the relations with various international powers. A wave of popular uprisings, which started at the beginning of the last decade, drove several countries of the region into wars and civil and regional conflicts, unfortunately. This, in turn, created an environment for the growth and spread of armed and extremist groups that undermined the remaining powers of the state, creating security and strategic vacuums, which several regional and international players sought to exploit to enhance their influence in the region. There have been also changes in the positions and relations of international powers with countries of the region. The US, for example, has been shifting its focus towards other regions which it deems more important, and China and Russia have been strengthening their presence and relations with regional countries. This has led to changes in the nature of existing alliances in the region. Furthermore, there have been changes in relations and alliances between countries, especially in light of the Abrahamic Accords, which laid out a roadmap for building the new Middle East that embraces the values of peace, tolerance, and coexistence. Of course, to achieve security and prosperity for all. These changes have raised important questions about the future of the area and the nature of its relations and alliances with international players. This symposium aims to provide a platform for the constructive discussions of these transformations and their implications. Experts and specialists on Middle East today will deliver insights on the expected outcomes of current and future transformations and present recommendations, most importantly, to support development, peace, and stability in the Middle East, and of course, for the world at large. Ladies and gentlemen, the theory of regional security complex developed by the Copenhagen School of International Security Studies could not be more relevant than in its today in terms of understanding Middle East politics in general and regional security in particular. The regional security complex, RSC, theory is mainly based on the idea or notion of security interdependence or the patterns of amity and enmity among Middle East countries. This particular variable has been experienced a major change since the signing of the Abrahamic Accords, which proclaims to promote, among other things, interfaith and cultural dialogue in the pursuit of peace, security, and prosperity, of course, in the Middle East. What does the Middle East regional security complex look like in terms of security interdependence and regional polarity 2 years after the signing of the Accords? And what is the impact of the Russian-Ukrainian war on great power interventions in the region? These are two very important questions I would like our distinguished experts participating in this conference to shed light on. Thank you very much.
Many thanks to Alia. The symposium is structured into 3 main sections. We'll start off with the first panel titled The Middle East and the New International Balances, which will be moderated by Rahaf Al-Khazraji, Deputy Head of Publishing Section and a researcher at Trends Research and Advisory. Rahaf?
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the session entitled the Middle East, and the new international balances. Now, before I introduce our two distinguished speakers, I'd like to first give you a brief perspective on the Middle East regional security complex. The regional security complex is characterized by a high level of uncertainty, a high degree of turbulence, negative security interdependencies, and the involvement of great powers. Now, all these characteristics have implications for regional stability and balance of power. The key elements that have led to the formation of negative interdependencies between actors are race, religion, history, oil and gas reserves, and protracted conflicts. Ethnic and religious differences play an important role in identifying the other, which in turn impact the formation of security alliances in the region. The involvement of great powers in the Middle East security complex can be explained by the region's oil and gas reserves, as well as a strategic location and control over several major waterways. The Middle East is changing due to variables emanating from both the international system and the regional context, which is what our distinguished speakers are going to shed light on today. I will open the floor for each speaker to deliver a 10-minute overview inspired by their distinguished perspectives, which will be followed by an open discussion at the end of the session. Our first speaker is Dr. Sean Yom, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Temple University and Senior Fellow at the Project for Middle East Democracy. Dr. Yom will examine the implications of the gradual reduction of American involvement and greater Russian and Chinese involvement in the Middle East for the future of regional stability. Dr. Yom, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for the for the introduction. Thank you all for being here today at this conference. I teach very locally. I'm based at Temple University, just not too far away. And I'm happy to be here back at Penn, happy to be speaking to an international audience, and happy to be imparting what I hope to be some usable insights into what I think a good number of other political scientists of the region think in terms of regional future and the broader geopolitical arc of regional stability. I'm very happy that the earlier speakers today brought up the notion of a regional security complex, because that concept is one that girds much of our theoretical thinking about how we conceptualize regional order in the Middle East and North Africa, the MENA region. By regional order, we typically mean the overall patterns of relationships, organized power, and normative values that shape how politics is conducted and how states fundamentally approach one another. And it's my belief that right now, that regional order is at an inflection point that rests at the convergence of a few forces, broad, global, and structural forces that bear witness and that need to be unpacked for us to think about implications in specific arenas of conflict, as well as certain issue areas across the region. So here are, in my estimation, what those structural forces are at the current moment. The first one is there is a gradual but perceivable decline of American hegemony. And by decline, I mean a gradual drawdown. At the height of, to give you some background on this, because I think this is an issue that is debated quite frequently in Washington and I think chronically misunderstood. So it was within living memory for many of us that the Middle East and North Africa rested at the apogee of American hegemony. Regional order in the mid to late 2000s, at the height of the American occupation of Iraq, was girded by a very strong understanding that the rules of the regional game and interstate disputes were regulated by the threat of coercive action from Washington. Regime change and nation building were options on the geopolitical table, right? And to give you the concrete ramification of this, it is the following, that anywhere and potentially at any time, the US could project its military supremacy to change the regime of a sovereign nation state and to rebuild that political order into one that more approximated America's self-conceived liberal democratic image, right? And as the conceit of that hegemony obviously was not just lost in the Iraqi occupation, but the conceit of that hegemony is gone. Gone because from the late Obama period, continuing through the Trump administration, and then continuing today under the Biden administration, I think that there has been, and I think many people would agree, that there has been a marked recalibration of American strategic interests away from the Middle East. But that recalibration is not only because there is greater interest in engaging China in the Pacific Rim, there's greater tension about what Russia might or might not do in Europe. It's also driven by the understanding held in Washington that the Middle East and North Africa is no longer the frontier or proving ground for American hegemony, and that coercive interventions through regime change and nation building generally don't lead to constructive outcomes. A friend of mine who used to work in one of the past administrations put it to me this way. He said, give me an example of nation building that America has undertaken in the Middle East that's worked, right? You have a case like Iraq that it's still working out is the most optimistic way of putting it. Think about a case like Libya, where you had a coercive intervention through the air, but not much nation building on the ground. That didn't end up very well. Think about proxified civil wars like Syria, where you have covert interventions, no real commitment to nation building, but still pressure for regime change. That hasn't elicited positive change on the ground. So in almost every single case study we have of American nation building in the Middle East, it hasn't worked out well. What are the chances that some new administration in Washington will crack the code and figure out how to make it work? Probability is very low. So all that, I think, is girding and understanding that not just because of the greater economic and military importance of the Pacific Rim and East Asia, and not only because of caution and fear about Russian advances elsewhere in the world, but given the understanding that the Middle East is no longer the central pillar of American foreign policy, there has been, I think, a tangible decline in American hegemony. Now, decline here does not mean that America is pulling out of the Middle East. I've seen in editorials and policy papers over the past few years, as the US retreated from Afghanistan, that there were the predominant perception that the US was somehow abandoning the Arab world or leaving the Arabian or the Persian Gulf, and therefore replicating the trajectory of the British exit in the 1950s, 60s, and through 1971. That's not true either. Right, the US is not closing any military bases in the region, at least its core bases in the Gulf. In fact, some of you might know that the US is engaged in a massive military buildup in eastern Jordan now, centered at some of its air facilities there. The focus of American power in the Middle East is no longer the exercise of hegemonic muscle through regime change and nation building. It is moving from the role of a policeman to a fireman, right? No longer concerned with the regulation of regional order as a policeman might, but rather stamping out brush fires, preventing small-scale crises from becoming bigger, and containing immediate kinetic threats. By that, I mean, for instance, terrorist movements, militant organizations like Daesh, the containment of Iranian ambitions in Syria and elsewhere, threats that can be conveyed in military terms and that measurably harm the sovereignty or interests of core American allies like Egypt or Jordan or Saudi Arabia. Beyond that, I think there's acute uncertainty about where regional order might go. And it's in the shadow of this gradual drawdown of American hegemony, not retreat, but a drawdown, that we get to a second convergent force, which is the increased involvement of Russian and Chinese interests. I think there has been, both in academia and in the policy world, some misunderstanding about what Russian interests entail in the Middle East and what Chinese interests entail. And I think at this point, at not even the twilight, but the dawn of the drawdown of American hegemony, it's too early to make long-term predictions, but this much is clear. It is absolutely I think it's absolutely indisputable that the Russian government desires closer ties with most Middle East and North African states, but that its interest as of this moment remains fairly limited to securitized relationships, arms sales, and making marginal advances in certain conflict zones like Syria that might undermine the projection of Western influence, right? So it's fairly compartmentalized, I think, at the current moment in security and military affairs. Now, conversely, Chinese interests are different. The Chinese government, and again, this is a very presentist statement, that's as of now, do not seem overly concerned with striking long-term military and securitized relationships. They might in the future, but that's not where most of their energy goes. Right now, most of their energy is expended on long-term economic relationships, investment relationships, and trade relationships. I mean, China is the biggest trade partner of Sudan. China is the biggest foreign investor of Algeria, right? But how many Chinese arms does the Algerian government buy? It's minuscule. So we have, on the one hand, a Russian set of interests that is primarily boring into the military and security side. And we have an emergent Chinese great power that's interested in striking long-term economic and financial partnerships with the potential for securitization. Now, combine all that with the fairly positive views that most Arab publics have of the Chinese government. Our best survey instruments like the Arab Barometer all indicate that, all else being equal, most regional populations would welcome closer ties with the Chinese government, not weaker ties. And we get a sense that regional order, right, at the dawn of the drawdown of American hegemony, will be infused with what I would call the pluralization of outside interests. Russian interests on the security side, Chinese interests on the economic side, and still a waning desire on part of Washington to control the growth of kinetic and conflictual threats in the region, but without expending the extraordinary energies and resources required to engage in the ultimate exercise of hegemony, which is military invasion, regime change, and nation building. And all of this, I think, dovetails into the ultimate problems facing the region. And I think all of us can relate to these, which are the fragility of many nation states and the inflammability of conflict zones riven by different ideological and structural schisms. There is disagreement in the Arab public sphere, for instance, about what ideas like Islamism should mean for the future. There's disagreement about what ideas regarding liberalism and democracy ought to mean. There is a constructed disagreement about what sectarianism means, about the so-called Sunni versus Shia axis, right? An axis which is as much a product, I think, of geopolitical imagination than of deep ancient hatreds. There's clearly disagreement in the Arab public sphere about the future of Israel and Palestine, and there are interstate disputes, as we know, in places like Libya and Yemen, where the number of foreign patrons and militia actors and non-state actors that are involved in these violent conflicts are so large that it's hard at times to keep everything tracked. You combine all that with, I think, domestic problems that some regional states face in terms of unemployment, post-pandemic economic recovery, gender inequality, youth empowerment, and you get, and I'll close on this point, again, a very broad sense that regional order is at an inflection point, right? The American hegemon is no longer the policeman girding regional rules. There's an increased role of Russian and Chinese interests, but in respective spheres of influence, and you have unresolved schisms and conflicts in the region driven by material and ideological concerns that are dovetailing into domestic problems that some Arab states face. And I think what this results in is a new era of pluralization, of uncertainty. It could be good, it could be bad, but one thing I think is indisputable, it's going to change. And I think that change is coming sooner than later.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Young, for your insightful contribution. I'll be moving on to our next speaker, Dr. Kenneth Katzman, who is joining us virtually today.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Good to be with you. Thank you for University of Pennsylvania and the Trends Research and Advisory. I appreciate it. I've worked with many institutions in the Gulf for many years. Very, very happy to be here. I'm speaking in a personal capacity today, not speaking for the Congressional Research Service, not speaking for the Congress or anybody in Congress. As I go gallop into the winding down of my federal career very soon. And I will join the think tank world myself, which might be interesting. So my presentation today, I generally agree with Dr. Yom that the United States is not seeking to determine domestic political outcomes in the region as it did with the wars in, let's say, Afghanistan, Iraq, and with even before that, there was pressure on many of the Arab states to undertake reform, political reform, democratization. The United States has definitely become less involved, let's say, in the domestic regime characteristics of the region. There was a very serious uprising in Syria. As you know, the United States did not really get involved in that. There's some involvement now to keep the Islamic State limited, but really the United States did not get involved as far as Assad's regime, and that stayed in place. I would have some disagreement with Dr. Yom on the role of Russia. I think Russia, the last 6-7 months has shown that Russia is not in the same league as the United States. Russia is not in a position to be particularly influential in the region. Russian forces have done poorly. And in fact, Russia is taking forces out of the region, out of Syria, because it needs them in Ukraine, where its effort is embarrassingly failed and faltering dramatically. I think many of the Arab states who were engaged, have been engaging Russia for the past few years, have now realized that they were placing bets on the wrong horse. This is a weak horse. This is not a horse to bet on. And the United States has proven that, its technology, its level of proficiency, efficiency, effectiveness, its global logistical chain, logistical capability, technological capability is light years superior, let's say, to that of Russia, Russian equipment, Russian military equipment, Russian power. And the United States is again, I think, the big actor for many states in the region to be dealt with. I think Tehran, much of my presentation today is supposed to be on Iran. Be glad to talk about Iran. Obviously, Iran has placed a big bet on Russia. That is a losing bet. That is a lost bet. They have lost their money on that bet. We talk about regional security. There really cannot be security in the Gulf, in the region, with the Islamic Republic of Iran as active as it is. Iran has been extremely effective. Its strategic power continues to grow. Excuse me. I'm very allergic these days. Iran has the largest missile arsenal in the region. Iran is not only developed its own armed drones, it is now selling armed drones abroad. It is manufacturing armed drones in Tajikistan. It has just delivered armed drones to Russia, where to help Russia's faltering effort in Ukraine. I fully agree that China is mainly an economic actor in the region. It's just not a strategic actor. I fully agree with Dr. Yom about that. Russia, obviously, we might have a discussion after our presentations, but the Islamic Republic of Iran is in many ways in Washington, where I sit, it's in many ways, it's mentioned in the same breath as Russia and China as far as a strategic threat to the United States. Iran is no longer a threat to be dismissed. It is a major actor with capabilities that are now widely respected by the United States in the region, certainly. Iranian attacks, missile attacks, drone attacks have forced Saudi Arabia, the UAE to the bargaining table. Both countries have sought to engage Tehran to try to lower tensions. They are no longer agitating for some sort of a United States major unrelenting pressure on Iran. They now support the idea of possibly re-entering the nuclear deal with Iran as a way of lowering tensions, as a way of making sure Iran doesn't achieve a nuclear weapons capacity. Iran gave short-range ballistic missiles to the Houthi movement in Yemen, which were used to devastating effect against the kingdom, to some extent against the UAE. Iran has armed Iraqi militias in Iraq. They nearly assassinated Prime Minister Khademi a few months ago. Those factions, the armed factions that Tehran supports, are now in at least a position to determine the next government. They may not do it. Muqtada Sadr is obviously against them, and there's a huge rift in Iraq in the Shia community in Iraq. But these factions are still very powerful. In Syria, Iran backs militias that are continuing to, in some cases, attack U.S. bases, Al-Tanf base, etc. Hezbollah threatening to attack Israeli gas development in the Eastern Mediterranean. So, I think my point is Iran is now a major strategic actor. And this is from capabilities it developed largely indigenously. Because Iran has been heavily sanctioned, it was not able to obtain easily weaponry or technology abroad. And so it obtained some technology and missile technology from China, North Korea, Russia in the past, but it's been able to re-engineer this technology and upgrade it by itself. Particularly as I mentioned, what Iran is doing with armed drones now, extremely sophisticated. And so Tehran is a major actor. Now the question, of course, in my job, we deal with U.S. policy. What is the appropriate response? What should the United States do to lower the threat profile from the Islamic Republic of Iran? And I think obviously the intent of getting back into the nuclear deal is to make sure Iran cannot achieve a nuclear capability. A nuclear armed Iran would be even exponentially more dangerous than it is now. And the hope is that if there can be, a return to the nuclear deal, then talks could be expanded later into missile limitations, drone limitations potentially, conflict resolution in Yemen, in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, which would deprive Tehran of the sources of its leverage. The sources of Iran's leverage are these conflicts, which Iran is able to arm various factions to be major actors in this conflict. If the conflicts disappear, then Tehran has no leverage to be a major strategic actor in these conflicts, in these locations, in these countries. So there are various different ways American policy could go. Obviously, I'm not yet, at least till I leave government, I'm not yet in the business of actually recommending U.S. policy. I'm still have to be fairly cautious. But, obviously, if there is a nuclear deal, I think maybe we have a chance to have some substantive talks with Iran to resolve the remainder of the files that continue to put the United States and Iran at odds, even more than 40 years since the Islamic Revolution. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Katzman, for your valuable input. I'll be moving on to an open session. I have a couple of questions for both Dr. Yom and Dr. Katzman. But my first question is for Dr. Sean Yom. So as you mentioned already, both China and Russia are working to strengthen their security and economic presence in the MENA region and the Gulf in particular. Do you think that the option of reducing American presence in the region under these circumstances serves American interest?
That's a great question. I think we should take a step back and ask what American interests are in the Middle East and how they've changed over the past 2 decades. I think there's a certain core of American interests which is quite legible to us and that haven't really changed over the past generation. involving, for instance, a desire for regional stability, the protection of regional hydrocarbon assets, support for Israel, the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the containment of ideologically radical threats that is seen as, or that are seen as cancers on the region, things like Salafi jihadism, for instance. I think from the mid to late 2000s, the idea of promoting democracy by force through regime change and nation building became part of that complex of American interests in the region, and it has since gone. And I think what you're seeing now, and to answer your question about the increased involvement of non-American great powers and the reduction of a strategic reduction of the American presence in the region, reflects exactly that point. And understanding that if the US is not in the business of regime change, nation building, and coercive interventions on a massive scale, then there are voices in Washington, bipartisan voices, who believe that we can achieve the remainder of our interests, right? The protection of hydrocarbon assets, the maintenance of regional stability, the containment of violent extremist threats, including Iran, because I think Iran is, as Kenneth said, Iran is, I think, one of the core adversaries of the United States in the regional game as currently construed. I think there's an understanding that even with the reduced strategic presence, the US can rely upon its local alliances and regional, I would say local alliances and regional actors like Saudi Arabia to match or to help support or to help satisfy these pre-existing interests. And I think we saw that with American support for the Abraham Accords. I think we see this with American support for more regional indigenous military organization and military alliance building. I think we certainly see this with American military interests in terms of maintaining our current basing structure in the Gulf, but also continuing to provide security assistance and military support to important states like Jordan and Egypt, so that in a potential future conflict scenario, they hopefully will be able to contribute and fend for themselves. So that's the conceit in Washington, I feel, that the US, yes, the US can achieve its remaining strategic interests in the region despite having a reduced strategic presence, because if the US is no longer in the business of going to war, not covert interventions, not intelligence operations, not airstrikes, but visceral, boots on the ground, conventional warfare. If the US is no longer in the business of waging that, then the US doesn't need to flex its muscle as it once did, and it can rely upon regional allies and alliances to achieve the remainder of its interests.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Yuan. My next question is for Dr. Kenneth Katzman. So the GCC states are not part of the JCPOA negotiations. So if these negotiations is indeed revived, what will that mean for the countries in the Gulf? And is any deal better than no deal in your mind?
Well, a revival of the deal takes the idea of an Iranian nuclear weapon off the table. So in my view, my analysis is that is highly stabilizing, highly beneficial to the security of the GCC states. Now, I'm well aware that the GCC states, some of them have wanted a seat at the table in these negotiations. They have wanted for a long time that the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, be broadened to include regional issues. Iran's, what I was talking about, Iran's support for armed factions. And for Tehran, that is absolutely a non-starter. They absolutely will not discuss integrating Iranian support for various factions in the region into the JCPOA. Because Iran's view is everybody's interfering in the region, everybody has proxies, everybody is involved, and Iran is not going to be told they cannot spread their influence and everybody else can without any restraint. and Iran has restraints. So it has just never been anything that the Islamic Republic is going to discuss, limitations on supporting armed factions as part of the JCPOA. So some of the GCC states have insisted to integrate that topic into the JCPOA, and it's always been unrealistic, and the US negotiators have seen that insistence as a way of killing the deal or making sure the deal never happens and there is no nuclear deal. And for that reason, US negotiators have rejected GCC pressure to expand the Iran nuclear talks to include Iranian influence in the region through supporting all factions. Thank you.
Dr. Katzman, don't you think that the Gulf countries should be included, especially that they will be the first to be affected because of these negotiations?
Well, again, if Iran was willing to include some of those issues in the talks, then okay, but it's not. And so you're faced with a choice of either having Iran that marches inexorably toward a nuclear weapon, or limiting the deal to nuclear issues, which does benefit the GCC. So that's been the US position, and I think there's some solid and sound basis for that position.
Thank you, Dr. Katzman. Before I move on to my last question, I'd like to give some space for our audience to ask some questions if you have any.
Hi, thank you for this great presentation. My question is to Prof. Sean Yom. There are two groups, I think, or two voices in Washington. Like one group pushes or say that the Middle East or the Gulf countries, the region lost its strategic value, and the United States should go to the east, or should they have bigger competitor? And the other group says no, the Middle East or the Gulf still, the value still, strategic value still remain the Gulf, the oil, security of Israel, and also terrorism. And now we see also Biden summer trip to the region, which emphasize the partnership of the United States to the Gulf countries. And he said that exactly, that the United States will not leave a vacuum for the Chinese or the Russian. The people who pushes for against the value of Middle East, such as Tamara Hoffman or Barry Bozar. So do you think that the region really lost its strategic interest in the near future, for example, taking into consideration the United States energy independent now? Thank you.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's a great question. Just like old times in class, right? So no, that's a fantastic question, and I think that is not the $1 million question. That is the billion dirham question, because the importance of the Gulf to American foreign policy will be the determinant of any future American commitment to, for instance, protect the GCC against a hypothetical Iranian aggression, to project coercive power back into the Gulf through war making, or to, I think, impose or reimpose a more stern set of guidelines about how regional order ought to be conducted. I mean, I think you're right that there are competing camps in Washington, but I do think that there are a few factors to bear in mind. One is that the fatigue from Iraq, and despite the debacle that was Afghanistan, I think the fatigue that not just many American policymakers share about those nation-building exercises, but the fatigue felt in the American public is such that there will be a lot of resistance to any large-scale militarized action by the U.S. Against, say, Iranian provocation. I think that allergy not militarization, because the Gulf is militarized. The US is not shutting down its bases, but the allergy to waging a new conventional war. We saw this clearly in the Trump administration, where the Iranian provocations culminating in attacks on Saudi oil facilities were met by a shrug from Washington and a promise that we would upgrade Saudi air defenses. I mean, we invaded Iraq for less, right? So the idea that the Gulf has lowered priority in American foreign policy, I think, has purchased because of that, the allergy to the human cost of a future conflict. Now, that being said, I think there's also agreement that Iran is a detrimental actor. There are few people in Washington who are sympathetic, I think, to Iranian actions in Yemen, in Iraq, and Syria. I mean, even the Jordanians, the Jordanian press, and I read the Jordanian press diligently, the Jordanian press is picking up the presence of Iranian militias or Iranian-supported militias on the Jordanian-Syrian border. And they're raising the alarm, and they're telling their American friends that you need to do something about this. I think the US believes, and again, this is an emerging consensus, and there's still debate, but there is a belief that so long as the US retains its current basing structure, it pivots some of its military forces to eastern Jordan and maintains cordial enough ties with the Iraqi government such that the US could re-enter Iraq in a future conflict, then it believes that with whatever resources it has left to spend in the Gulf, that Iran can be sufficiently dealt with through a combination of the JCPOA, potential coercive threats on a small scale basis, and by further building up the military strength of its allies in the Gulf, in the Emirates, in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, and in Qatar. I think that is a predominant belief. It signals that the Gulf has lowered in global priority for the US. I mean, that's clear in terms of funding, in terms of just where the US is shifting its attention strategically. I think that's clear. But that's also coexisting in the same policy space as the idea that, all else being equal, of all the threats in the Middle East that the US cares the most about right now, right, post-Syria, post-Daesh, which is the one that the US wants to contain the most, it is Iran, right? And so that will be the pivot point by which we can test future American resolve for further military engagement.
Two questions. First, on what theoretical ground do you put Egypt, Algeria, Sudan in the Middle East? And the second question, can there be any stability in the Middle East without the resolution of the Palestinian statehood question?
Kenneth, do you want to field that one?
And I think I won't only be comfortable with the Israeli-Palestinian issue. The other countries I haven't really focused on that much in my career. But I mean, you know, as we've seen, we talked about the Abraham Accords. So it was talked about already on this session to some extent. As we've seen, some of the Gulf states are willing to de-emphasize Palestinian interests for the broader goal of containing the Islamic Republic of Iran. The UAE, Bahrain have normalized relations now with Iran. Sudan, with Israel, sorry. Sudan joined, Morocco joined also. They add to Egypt and Jordan, which already had peace treaties with Israel. We're now seeing very serious negotiations between Israel and Lebanon on the sea border. They're being negotiated by my former colleague in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Amos Hochstein. I served there briefly on a detail for a while. He was working there too. So the Arab states seem willing to de-emphasize Palestinian interests. I think that's very clear. And you know, this has not been really, I would say, a priority. Resolving the Israeli Palestinian dispute has not evidently been a major priority for U.S. policy in recent years either. I think, for 40, 50 years, it was a high priority. Now it really, I would say since September 11 attacks, it has not been a priority. So I think these other issues, Iran, radical Islamic extremism, Islamist extremism, these are the main issues that the United States is focused on: proliferation, chemical weapons, weapons of mass destruction. These are issues that the U.S. is focused on much more than the Israeli-Palestinian dispute at this point. Thank you.
I can just field the first question quickly. I mean, geographically speaking, Egypt, Sudan, Algeria, I mean, these are countries in Africa, of course. I think we think about these countries in our constructed foreign policy imaginations because I think as part of the broader Middle East, North Africa regional complex or regional order, because that's the way they've been treated by great powers as part of regional order for much of the past century. And culturally, if you think about regional organizations like the Arab League and whatnot, and the historical notion of the Arab world, al-Alam al-Arabi, there's been an understanding that countries like Egypt and Sudan, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, I mean, they exist in multiple spheres at the same time. They're part of the Arab world. They're also African countries, right? So they can exist in multiple spaces in the same, with their in the same sovereign, with their singular sovereignty. But I think in terms of how we're addressing their strategic concerns today, for instance, or how American policymakers address it, it's because of an historical artifact that they've been treated as part of what we would call the MENA regional order, Middle East and North Africa, by great powers for a century. And we know that there are imperial lineages that precede that result in that categorization. And for better or for worse, that's how we often describe them. But you're absolutely right. I mean, because I think the impulse of your question is to uncover, and rightly so, that these are not just countries included in the Middle East regional complex. These are also African countries, right? And they have their own inward-facing continental interests as well with Africa. And that is an important set of concerns. And I know that there are other scholars working on those issues.
Thank you, Dr. Yoam. So anyone else? Okay, I'll have one more question. So it's a general one, either Dr. Yoam or Dr. Kasman can answer. So the US has a working relationship with several countries in the region. Many of the countries are experiencing socioeconomic challenges and are imbued in regional rivalries. Under these circumstances, which countries, from your perspective, can be seen as reliable partners of the United States? Dr. Katzman?
Well, fortunately, I mean, the United States has a lot of partners in the region. Obviously, Jordan, Egypt, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain, many partners. To some extent, Lebanon, maybe a little bit less so, but still, a partner on many issues. The government, at least, not some of the factions that are influential in Lebanon, but Turkey, not an Arab state, but the United States is trying to work with Turkey on various issues pertaining to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the United States has really no shortage of partners in the region. The United States has helped broker, a ceasefire in Yemen. The United States would like to see that conflict come to an end as well. No shortage of partners, as we've discussed. Dr. Yoam discussed. We've moved some equipment from the Gulf further away from the Gulf, out of Iranian range to or less easily reachable from Iran to Jordan. Some strategic depth there. The United States has a lot of options, a lot of friends, and I think given Russia's actions in Ukraine, the United States will have even more friends, and the U.S. friends will be even more willing to work with the United States, given Russian actions, how Russia's behaved with Ukraine, how isolated Russia's become, and how disastrous its performance on the battlefield has proved which shows that Russia is not an equal or even in the same league as the United States of America. Thank you.
Yes, I completely agree. I mean, I think the U.S. is at a unique historical moment, and this is why I think the inflection point we've reached in regional order is historically unprecedented. It's not as if countries are turning their backs on the U.S. There are no pre-existing partnerships or alliances which are imperiled right now in the region between Washington and local states, right? And the U.S. is not facing a massive post-imperial economic or military decline as the British did after World War II. And so the US is in a position where still as a hegemonic great power, it has many friends. Clearly, it's supporting Jordan economically and militarily, so giving the Egyptian government considerable assistance and aid, friends all over North Africa, critical allies in the Gulf. There's no shortage of embedded allies in the region for American hegemony. The dilemma is this: what is the tripwire for the exercise of that hegemony, right? And by this, I mean, again, if you are no longer a policeman regulating regional order, but a fireman dedicated to stamping out brush fires and hoping that your local partners will do the other hard work, at what point do you enter and wage conflict or expend considerable resources to restore that regional order? Because it's clearly not Iranian provocation, because the US has accepted much of it over the past decade. It's clearly not civil war, because we've seen civil wars rage in a number of conflict zones and eliciting little more than covert interventions and support for our favored militias and sides. There is acute strategic uncertainty now among all the allies and friends that Dr. Katzman had mentioned about this question. At what point, given that these alliances are strong, at what point does the US activate them, go one step further, and flex its muscle as a hegemon? That is the question that we need to answer in the coming years and decades.
Does anyone have any other questions?
Question comes from the writer Abdullah Al-Junaid from Bahrain. He asks, I think, Kenneth Katzman, Biden administration has promised the Gulf countries that disruptive regional activities of Iran will be included in the nuclear deal. And this is, I think, the bigger concern of Gulf countries, because if Iran has a bomb, it's a global matter, not a regional or Gulf matter. But for us in the Gulf, the only concern, or the first concern for us regarding Iran, is the regional activities, as you know it. So do you think that the Biden administration will listen to the Gulf countries' concern to include regional activities of Iran in the nuclear deal? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. We discussed exactly this topic a few minutes ago. Unfortunately, no, the United States will not include Iran's regional activities in the nuclear agreement issues, because Iran will not agree to incorporate those issues into the nuclear deal. It's just not acceptable to Tehran to broaden the discussion beyond nuclear issues and sanctions relief. So no, the United States will not agree. But what the United States has said is, if we have this agreement, if we can restore this agreement, then we can have follow-on negotiations. We can build trust. We can see Iran comply. The US will comply, build some trust, confidence building, and then try to expand discussions with Tehran for maybe a follow-on agreement that might incorporate Iranian support for armed factions in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shamil.
I was just gonna add one other thing about this issue, the Iranian nuclear deal, because I think there are different ways we can debate the wisdom of the deal. But I think one opinion that Dr. Katzman mentioned that I think deserves to be considered further is that the nuclear deal with Iran is not a one-off concession. It's not a singular model for dealing with a so-called rogue or dangerous state, and then you never deal with this again. When it was initially conceived a decade ago, the idea was that if we provide a framework for reintegrating Iran into regional order, and with tit for tat concessions where we provide cover for them doing things that may be unpopular for them, but we also have to provide concessions on our side, then there could have been, I think before the Trump administration, there could have been a pathway for a meaningful reincorporation of Iran into the regional security complex. And I think the opportunity we lost over the last 5 to 6 years is that not just the destruction of the deal, but the relegation of the Iranian state and Iranian state institutions, for instance, with the terrorist organization designation, it did such great lasting damage to not just our relationship with Iran, but I think it helped catalyze a shift in domestic politics in Iran. So the people that we're negotiating now with the peace talks are not the same people we were negotiating with a decade ago, right? They're not the same voices. It makes it harder to strike a long-term deal. And if we return to the bargaining table and think about a nuclear framework as not even a framework, but an entree to a long-term trajectory of potentially defanging an adversary by providing positive incentives to engage in regional order building, as opposed to looking at regional order as a zero-sum game, that I think is where the greatest hope lies. But I share everyone's pessimism. We're a long way off from that. And I think the issue of Iran's subversive activities in places like Yemen and Syria and Iraq, they need to be dealt with not on the same table as the nuclear deal, but either in the future or on the side, because they're not helping regional stability and they're not helping the security of human populations in these states.
Thank you. Dr. Katzman, any final remarks?
I mean, I would just, that's what I was getting at as well. I mean, the idea of the JCPOA originally was to have the deal, limit Iran's nuclear program, and then build it out into a new relationship with Iran that could even potentially have led to a normalization of U.S. relations with Iran. And it didn't happen. And, obviously Iran is more recalcitrant now because Iran's view is they were complying with the deal and the United States still left. And so the pullout has been, as we've seen, very hard to resurrect, to correct, and to build back to where we were in 2015, 2016. And that accounts for some of the tit for tat attacks and clashes, and Iran's authorizing assassinations on former U.S. officials and keeping American citizens in jail in Iran, and a lot of tensions and the failure thus far to complete this revised JCPOA agreement. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the insightful discussion. Now, let's move forward to the second panel, the future of the United States Gulf Alliance, which will be moderated by Awad Al-Breaki, Chief of the Global Sector at Trends Research and Advisory.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second session, the future of U.S. Gulf Alliance. My name is Awad Al-Breaki. I'm the Chief Global Officer at Trend Research and Advisory, and I'm privileged and delighted to moderate this session with great speakers. Ambassador Marcel Wahba, who is joining us virtually, and also Dr. Farah, who is joining us physically here. We're going to have initial remarks of 10 minutes from each speaker, then we'll try, hopefully, to engage in QA session. Before I give the floor to our panelists, let me say a few words. As we know, our conversation today takes place at a critical time in U.S. Gulf relationship. Beside more than 2 decades down the road, the new cold has made its way into the once friendly ties between U.S. and the Gulf partners. Although Washington is still the primary interlocutor of Middle Eastern countries in many profiles of strategic relevance, growing doubts about the American security guarantees and commitment to the current regional status quo have developed a searing disappointment, especially among the Gulf countries. As the U.S. is gradually recalibrating its foreign policy canvas to serve its new strategic priorities, Washington is called to deal with a heavy legacy in the region and define a new Middle Eastern policy. Among other things, President Biden's summer trip to the region has sought to clear the air and narrow the gap separating the United States and its regional partners. Burdened by the severe trust deficit, Washington will need more than a meeting to restore a meaningful confidence among Middle Eastern friends. However, despite the underlying friction and tension, the Jeddah summit has a silver line. The United States and its regional partner signal a residual will to work together on a joint solution to issues of mutual concern, such as food, energy, and climate security. To what extent this endeavor will succeed depends on the actors' capacity to shelve their differences and give continuity to the current momentum. On this positive note, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Ambassador Marcel Wahba. Ambassador Wahba is a former ambassador to the United Arab Emirates and President Emirates and distinguished fellow of the Arab Gulf State Institute in Washington, where she served as a founding president of the center from 2014 to 2019. Ambassador Wahba retired from the U.S. Department of State in 2008, ranked Minister Counselor after 22 years in the foreign service, spent mostly in the Middle East. She received the White House Presidential Meritorious Service Award for her service in the UAE. Finally, Ambassador Wahba is a member of Council on Foreign Relations. She also serves in the Board of Council on International Education and Exchange and in the Board of Advisor to the bilateral U.S.-Arab Chamber of Commerce. Without further ado, the floor is yours, Ambassador Wahba.
Thank you so very much, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you virtually. Unfortunately, I couldn't be there in person, but I want to thank Trends Research and Advisory and the Middle East Center of the University of Pennsylvania for inviting me to be with you today. The future of U.S. Gulf Alliance is certainly the hot topic, and many think tanks, not only in Washington, but throughout the region. But I'm going to start my 10-minute presentation with really a very basic concept, and I think a very realistic one, which is that the U.S. Gulf alliances are based on national security imperatives. And therefore, it's clear to us and to those in the region that the GCC countries need the United States and the United States needs them. The region remains central to the stability of the global economy and U.S. interests in the Middle East and beyond. It's important to remember that these bilateral relationships are long-standing and have survived turbulent times in the past, many even more critical than what we've seen in the past decade or two. None of the recent irritants, in my view, with key partners can negate or change the fundamentals of national security objectives on both sides. As you mentioned, during President Biden's trip to the region this summer, at least was a good start. It cannot be the one and only initiative led by the United States. But I think the president went out of his way during the GCC+3 meeting in Riyadh to quote, as he said, that the United States is going to remain active, engaged partner in the Middle East. And he added that we will not walk away and leave a vacuum to be filled by China, Russia, or Iran. Now, of course, there's a question about the presence and how you define the presence and how do you define engagement. While concerns or doubts persist in the Gulf states and in the US, particularly in the Congress, about each other's reliability, we have witnessed practical steps taken recently by both sides to rebuild and strengthen more cooperative partnerships as we look to the future. That said, it has been a difficult decade for the region and for the United States. We have seen significant geopolitical realignment throughout the Middle East, and particularly in the Gulf. The succession of younger, dynamic leaders willing to take more active roles in not only shaping their own country's economic and political development, but also at the regional political landscape level. And that is a significant change. The aftermath of the Arab Spring, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the rise of Islamic State, the growing tensions with Iran and Turkey all played a role in creating instability. The war in Yemen, breaking ties with Qatar by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, and Bahrain, the ongoing war in Syria, and political disarray in Lebanon, all further dominated the region and weakened the region. The United States has also undergone a very difficult decade with foreign wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, with much less public opinion support of such engagement in the region, and a debilitating partisan divide at home. The years of the Trump administration were unusual and chaotic both at home and abroad. The rejection by many Americans of the 2020 election results that led to the violence of January 6th were traumatic for the country as a whole and tore at the unity that many took for granted. America's domestic pressures, I want to underline, have undoubtedly had an impact on its role in global affairs and its effectiveness in responding to challenges both at home and abroad. Washington's global competitors gained ground and responded effectively to the strategic concerns, needs, and interests of the GCC countries in the economic, trade, energy, and technology sectors. While Washington, in my view, remains the primary and preferred security partner, it no longer enjoys that first rank in other sectors and can no longer legitimately question growing ties based on mutual interests with countries like China or Russia. Excuse me. Currently, we see a clear trend towards de-escalation of conflicts and confrontations in the Gulf. Led by the UAE and Saudi Arabia, the message is clear that this is a period of open dialogues and actively engaging to reduce tensions in the region and with outside powers. The GCC countries have prioritized economic underpinning and development as the main driving force behind their foreign policy. Issues of food security, climate change, energy diversification are taking central stage, particularly in the UAE and the Kingdom. We're seeing the shift to improving relations between the GCC and Turkey, as well as with Iran. The rift with Qatar is over, if not completely healed. The Yemen ceasefire seems to be holding, and Iraq's relations with the Gulf have dramatically improved. The Abraham Accords, now 2 years old, is clearly part of this transition towards dialogue and de-escalation of tension. Another example towards de-escalation and dialogue is the Egypt-Jordan-Iraq alliance, which was also part of the GCC+3 meeting. And it is very much supported by Washington, but also by the GCC countries. Saudi Arabia has strengthened its ties with Iraq and has allowed Iraq to play a role of mediator in their talks with Iran, something we would not have foreseen certainly 8 or 10 years ago. Both the UAE and Saudi Arabia have been reliable supporters of Egypt since the upheaval of the Arab Spring and have provided billions of dollars in aid. Bringing Jordan back into the fold through this grouping also provides Amman with stronger political and economic assistance. These initiatives and trends are important to keep in mind as the GCC countries play a more active and actually a leading role in shaping the political landscape of the region as a whole. Now, mutual concerns will take time to resolve. The erosion of confidence in Washington's reliability in the GCC countries will not be easy to overcome in a short period of time. Our Middle East allies have had differences and concerns with US policies that date back to the fall of the former Egyptian president Hosni Mubarak, also the Trump administration's decision not to respond to Iran's attacks on Saudi oil facilities in Al-Quaik and Khurais, and more recently to the chaotic US withdrawal from Afghanistan. These are major issues that have brought us to where we are today. In the UAE, there was clear unhappiness by the lack of immediate response from Washington to Houthi attacks that killed 3 people in Abu Dhabi, and the US refusal to redesignate the Houthis as a terrorist organization. Another major irritant, particularly in the US-UAE relationship, is American reluctance to approve certain weapons systems without imposing significant restrictions on their use. This issue made it impossible to proceed with military purchases like the F-35s. There was a belief in Washington on both sides of the aisle that there was a lack of transparency of agreements with China that may have threatened US sensitive technology. More recently, the tepid reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine by many of the GCC countries has been an irritant that has not been well received in Washington. What steps can we take to strengthen cooperative partnerships in the US and GCC countries? As I said earlier, the Biden administration is intent on reviving its leadership in the Gulf, primarily to slow down the region's increasing cooperation with China, while working to encourage our GCC allies to support containment of Tehran, particularly given the long impasse to renegotiate the nuclear agreement with Iran. I believe the administration hopes to create a loose but solid coalition under American leadership that allows the US to have a smaller but effective regional footprint. A realignment of US priorities of the Gulf will require intense and sustained diplomatic engagement. The Biden administration has declared its interest in doing so across a broad spectrum of economic and political initiatives to demonstrate its serious commitment to the region. The UAE, for example, has been actively seeking a new agreement to secure defense assurances from the United States. My understanding is that there is a draft agreement being discussed, and if agreed upon, would likely go beyond the benefits of the major non-NATO allies of the US that are currently in place with Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain. This agreement, if concluded, would be a significant addition to creating a more robust alliance of deterrence against Iran. In terms of recommendations going forward to revive and strengthen US GCC alliances, I'm certainly not in a position of recommending policies to the government, but I have to say from my experience, from my 22 years in diplomacy in the region, my first half of my career, I saw, and I was very actively involved in the US diplomatic role, which was extremely intense in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, on civil society issues. The US engaged on health issues. I remember the AIDS pandemic was on, and the US involvement in that was very front and center. No global power can convene diplomatic initiatives and bring people together as the United States can. And I believe strongly that if the Biden administration is serious about playing a more active role, engaging diplomatically to promote, encourage, facilitate normalization and de-escalation within the region, this will be a huge step forward for US GCC relationships and with the broader Middle East, especially as we look at the stagnation of the Israeli-Palestinian situation. But of course, this will take a more robust US engagement. And the question will be, does the US currently have the bandwidth to engage on some of these key regional issues, from food security to climate change, energy diversification? These are the issues that drive the foreign policies of the GCC countries. And if the US wants to be diplomatically engaged, it will have to respond to those issues. The issue of, looking at defense assurances with key allies, such as the current discussion with the UAE, this would also signal seriousness on the US commitment to the security of the region. Finally, I believe I would make one recommendation for the GCC, our allies in the GCC countries, and that would be to encourage a more appreciation for the current domestic political turmoil in the United States, and to adopt a clear policy of neutrality and to maintain strong ties on both sides of the aisle in domestic politics. And I think that would better serve the long-term interests of the US GCC alliances. I know we were going way over time in the last session, so I'm going to stop right there and hope that I didn't exceed my 10 minutes, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Ambassador Wahba. This is very interesting and informative. Now, allow me to switch to our second speaker, Dr. Farah Jan. She's a political scientist and senior lecturer teaching in the International Relations Program at UPenn. Her research focuses on interstate rivalries and alliance and causes and consequences of nuclear proliferation and the security politics of South Asia and the Middle East. Her writing has appeared in a range of scholarly publications, including Foreign Policy, Responsible Statecraft, The Diplomat, Foreign Policy Journal, and Democracy and Security. Dr. Farah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you to the Middle East Center for inviting me, and thank you to Trend for this event here. Following Ambassador Wahba is not easy. She laid down the ground and the points that, and I agree mostly with what she said. I wanted to start with a quote by the UAE's ambassador to Washington. He recently said, relationship with the United States is like any relationship. It has strong days where the relationship is very healthy and days where the relationship is under question. And we certainly are in a phase where the relationship at the moment is going through a period where it is questioned. But with that said, the Middle East is, and the GCC in particular, is and has been an important region for the United States. However, in recent years, relations between the GCC and the US have been on a rocky trajectory, which we all know about, to the degree that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, and UAE's President, Sheikh Mohammed bin Nahyan, declined US requests to speak to President Biden after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. With that said, the Gulf region is still very much under the US defense umbrella. The US has bases in Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait. The US protects the Gulf oil shipping lanes as an element of US national power and to protect our allies and our allies' interests in the region. Adding to the strained ties between the US and the GCC is the GCC's neutral stance with regards to Russia and Russian invasion of Ukraine. The UAE abstained the Security Council vote against Russia, and the other GCC states have remained silent on the Russian invasion. Now, many have argued that with the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, the US is more in a retrenchment mode, and that leaves a vacuum in the region that Russia and China are trying to fill. Moscow has already demonstrated its commitment to its traditional ally. After the Syrian revolution, Moscow stood, Vladimir Putin stood by Assad and send the signal to the US by first, there will be no more regime change in the Middle East. And secondly, it wanted to show to other GCC states and Middle Eastern states that Russia stands by its traditional allies, which it did. And thirdly, Moscow wanted to secure its base in Syria, which it did. So what does this mean for the future of the US GCC alliance? What should the US do with regards to growing Russian influence in the region and Chinese economic clout in the region? As the ambassador pointed out, we need to demonstrate our commitment to our allies. I do want to wrap it up with a statement from the same ambassador who pointed out that today we're going through a stress test, but I'm confident that we'll get out of it and get to a better place. Do I agree on that? I think it requires commitment on both sides, the US as well as the GCC side. The US's commitment with regards to its ally has been inconsistent, and we've seen that when it comes to South Asia and Pakistan, and we've seen its commitment to other allies remaining inconsistent. And on the GCC side, I think, they need to make it easier for the United States with regards to human rights and other issues involved. I want to keep my comments short and would like to engage more in a conversation.
Thanks, Dr. Farah. I would like now to open our conversation by asking Ambassador Wahba, following your recommendation of for the Gulf countries to have, let's say, a working relationship in both aisles. As you know, the election in November is coming up now, and also after 2 years will be the presidential election also. Do you think that this election would have an effect on U.S. Gulf relationship? If, let's say, if more Democrat or more Republican, like, be elected to the Congress, what we may expect from this election?
Well, I mean, right now the election is pretty close, so it's not clear. The conventional wisdom, at least around Washington, is that the Democrats will keep the Senate, but probably lose the House to a Republican majority, but not a huge majority. But all that is, projections. It could all change dramatically between now and November. I think the important point to remember is that U.S. national interests, foreign policy interests, don't really change with one administration to the other, but the tactics do. So we saw a different approach during the Trump administration, during the Clinton administration, during the Bush administration, in terms of how to engage and at what level, the priorities given to diplomacy versus, as the previous speaker talked about, the effort to do nation building and to put boots on the ground. So these things have changed depending on the issues, but the national interest really remains the same. So that's why my point earlier that it's important not to personalize relationships with American administrations that come and go, whereas in many cases, the leadership of these countries does not change that much, although it has in recent years. We've seen a whole new crop of young leaders coming in. But traditionally, it's best not to personalize the relationships too much and really to stay engaged with both sides of the House. Congress is a very important part of the foreign policy decision-making process. And that's where the engagement really needs to be bipartisan. Any U.S. administration, of course, leadership will have to talk to each other on a personal and professional basis. But in terms of engaging politically, it's better to engage with both sides of the House, regardless of which party has the majority in either Congress or in the Senate or in the White House.
Yes, I agree. And I think the polarization of American politics, as they say, all domestic politics is, all foreign policy is domestic politics.
Absolutely.
Has an effect. Anything?
I want to add one line to this question is going back to the statement by Adam Schiff. We know the position he's going to take, and it was with regards to Saudi Arabia, where he said he has nothing to do with the Crown Prince. With most of the elected officials, they have to go back and respond to their constituents. President Biden's point during the election was clear when he took a very hardline position with regards to Saudi Arabia. I think you'll see the consistency of that carry on. But as the ambassador pointed out, there's not major shift that'll occur.
Yeah. Excellent. To put a more futuristic look, how should the U.S. and the Gulf countries, there's a trust deficit to some extent now. So how both countries, the Gulf and the United States, reduce that deficit in the relationship? What you're gonna recommend both countries to do?
Is that question posed to me?
To you, yes, to you, Ambassador.
Okay. Okay. Well, I think some of the issues that we've seen over the past several years and the the unwillingness to take a phone call, or the fact that Washington didn't call to express condolences after the attack by the Houthis and so on, really became, in my view, almost, too personal, because the relationship should go above and beyond that by both sides. I'm not pointing fingers at any one side. So I think when you want to protect the importance of a relationship, Washington should have responded right away when Abu Dhabi got attacked by the Houthis. When the president wanted to reach out and talk to, the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia, or the Crown Prince, or who was then the Crown Prince in Abu Dhabi, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, in my view, they should have taken the calls, because the relationship is old, the relationship is strong, and I think both sides need each other. This is my personal opinion. If you ask any of the leaders in the region who they would prefer to have as their primary security umbrella, I don't think any of them would say Russia. I mean, I think that concept is just not even there. They want to talk to the Russians and have good relationships with Russia. They have energy interests in common with Russia. They have some military sales with Russia. But to be the guarantor of the region, I haven't heard that from a single senior or even citizen in any of the Gulf countries. Same thing with China. They're very interested in economic ties with China and trade ties with China, because these respond to their economic growth and development, and these are genuine interests. And as I said earlier, I think the US is in a very weak position to try and question those growing ties, because they are based on the national interests of the GCC countries. So how can we come in and say, oh, reduce your trade or economic ties with China? But at the same time, I don't hear anybody in the Gulf wanting China to play a security role or a political goal in the region and kind of overtake the US role. I haven't heard that, and I don't expect to hear it for a long time, unless something dramatically goes wrong between the region and the United States. So I think the relationship is very important to both sides. And in my opinion, both sides should work equally hard to protect that relationship and to keep it alive through diplomatic engagement and through speaking to one another. I know, for example, the president, when he was in Riyadh, he invited Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed to visit the United States this coming year, and I hope he will, because he hasn't been in the United States for several years. So I think those are important ties that need to be developed and nurtured.
Thank you. Yeah.
I agree with whatever Ambassador said, and I think the U.S. interests in the region are not just after the withdrawal of Afghanistan. We still have the issue of terrorism to be addressed, with the about 45,000 non-Syrian fighters in the camps in the northeast of Syria. For that, the United States needs to engage with GCC partners and other allies. And that engagement is
Good. Now I would like to open the floor for Q&A session. If any has a question, just raise your hand and we'll give you the microphone. Okay.
So I have two questions, actually. One is just to highlight and ask your reaction to the fact that although there's been a tremendous amount of attention to the importance of domestic politics in the United States, and how all politics, foreign policy is domestic politics, but almost no attention to the domestic politics in the Gulf.
Mm-hmm.
If it's important in the United States, it has to be important in some time frame in the Gulf, and I'd like some comments on what the implications are. Are they frozen? Are the regimes in the Gulf frozen? Are there changes imminent? Certainly there's a lot of stress. The other question I want to ask has to do with the way that the problem is framed, which I understand is a geopolitical diplomatic question, the United States and the Gulf mainly. If we look at it that way, we can imagine that the United States would be quite disappointed in the Gulf's and the GCC's reaction to the Ukraine situation and the energy crisis in Europe and in the Western Alliance, if you're asking why the United States is not more responsive to the needs or desires of the regimes in the Gulf, shouldn't the United States ask, why aren't our putative allies coming to helping us in our hour of need with just what they have to help with, which is a lot of natural gas and oil? So those are the two questions I would love to hear your reaction to.
I'll can I go there? Or Ambassador?
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. Let me answer the second question first. I agree with you wholeheartedly. And when I talked about the mutual concerns, I wanted to make a point of raising the issues that have really upset Washington as well. We know we've upset the Gulf in many ways over the last 10 years, but we also have had several areas where we were very unhappy with the reaction to, for example, the invasion of Russia, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Not only the tepid response in the UN, but also the ongoing warm relations and the visits with Moscow and so on. So yes, and the United States has the right to express those concerns, absolutely. In terms of domestic politics in the region, of course it's important, but it's very different for each country. So it's very hard to generalize the role of public opinion and domestic politics. These are not countries, democratic countries, and we don't see a lot of evidence of public opinion unless you're doing a lot of polling. But certainly the rulers in those countries pay attention to their domestic audiences and react to them and are very vigilant about doing that because they want to obviously stay in power. And they're not, some of them are looking at the whole region, there are some that are more ruthless than others, but I think it's fair to say that they have domestic concerns, and most of the time the US needs to take those concerns into account, but also to express domestic American public opinion concerns. For example, the whole Jamal Khashoggi thing, that had a lot to do with why at the time, presidential candidate Biden said what he said, and why Adam Schiff says what he said, because they were responding to their constituents where they are being dependent on their political life through their electorate. So again, the understanding on both sides needs to be always at the forefront. And I think a lot of these issues in the past were dealt with, kind of in person talks. And in the last 5-6 years, it seems that has fragmented somewhat. Social media has played a bigger role. And a lot of these, personal, hurt feelings, if you will, are no longer voiced in person, but kind of put out in the media and put out on Twitter and so on, which has not helped to keep the relationship on sound ground. Let me stop there because I'm sure my colleague, the speaker, wants to add to this.
I want to talk and point out on the Russian invasion question. I think it was disappointing to see the response that we got from the GCC states, even India for that matter, remained silent or took a very passive approach with regards to the Russian invasion. But if we see it through national interest, these states were looking out for their interest. The UAE has immense amount of investment in Russian companies. The current situation has resulted in the UAE being affected by that. So I think these states were simply looking out for their interests, but in turn, it affected their alliance with the United States. That for us is something to see how they responded. But with that said, as the ambassador pointed out earlier, the GCC needs the United States and the United States needs the GCC, not just in this one instant, but in the future as well. I don't think the relationship is, yes, it's going through a low point, but I think it's going to bounce back from the low point in the future.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Iran is a big state, and there's no amount of conceptual engineering that can remove that from that region. So what are the US and the Gulf state doing to improve relations with Iran to reduce the potential tension in the region?
So with the recent steps, the UAE have fully restored its ties with Iran. We've also seen Saudi Arabia improving ties and engaging with Iran. I think these are all positive steps for the region and for ties between the GCC and Iran. The low point was when the Qatar blockade or Qatar issue was going on, but right now we're moving on from that.
Ambassador, you want to add anything as a final remark?
Not really, but I think the initiatives that are taking place in the region, the UAE ambassador going back, the talks between Saudi Arabia and Tehran should be encouraged by the United States, because these are in our interest as well, that it reduces the tension and the potential for conflict in the region.
Final remark. Okay, good.
Hello, thank you so much. We repeatedly mentioned throughout this discussion and the discussion earlier about the importance of cooperation between the United States and the Middle East in such a complicated, turbulent time. Cooperation obviously has a lot of positive connotations, but it's also a lot of hard work. It requires accountability and sometimes enforcement. Given the difficult position that the United States is in, how exactly would you characterize its best options when it comes to keeping our partners accountable? You know, whether that's using carrots or sticks, or whatever it is, making sure that they stick to their agreements and ideally work closer to us without at the same time risking accidentally sending them towards perhaps Russia or China or someone else.
I think our relationship with the GCC and the US defense umbrella under which it comes, that protection itself is the carrots. And I think that relationship will remain. Your question for cooperation with regards to in which sector? Just cooperation generally or?
Cooperation generally, I think it's strategy related, so cooperation with Ukraine or
Ambassador, do you want to take a stab at this?
I didn't hear the last part very clearly, but I'll just make a general comment here. I'm not sure the wording accountability resonated with me. I think when we establish cooperative relationships, we have to recognize, first of all, that these are long-term relationships. Second, we enjoy excellent, and I underline excellent, military and intelligence ties with most of the countries in the GCC. And those are underpinnings for cultural ties, for people-to-people ties, for civil society, and for diplomatic engagement. What I think is important right now is for both sides to, again, kind of rise to the bigger picture and look at how we can engage more, not only cooperatively, but more robustly on the diplomatic side. As one of the speakers in the last session said, the US is no longer going to be putting boots on the ground or engaging in, building states or invading states. So I think the relationships need to focus on the issues that concern both sides: climate change, food security, a whole host of issues. But that does take a huge resource commitment from both sides. And both sides need to reach the point where they're willing to make those commitments and then sustain them. So that if you start talking about climate change, how do you build that network with the region and with the United States engaged fully in that? And how do you support the de-escalation of tension between Iran and the GCC countries, between what's going on in Iraq and promoting the stability of Iraq through engagement by the GCC countries, which we've done for a long time. But how do you do it in a more robust manner and more openly with the GCC as your partners, not your, not somebody that you need to give a carrot and stick to, but as a partner who has a stake in the game. And with that, I will stop there.
And just to add something to my closing remarks, I think China or Russia, neither is China prepared to provide defense security to the GCC, nor is Russia reliable in that sense. And that then brings us back to the table where the United States is the sole state that plays that role. And I don't think that position is going to change.
Excellent. And I think what we are doing here is to sustain that relation is people to people, exchange of ideas, of arguments. So thank you. And I hope all of you can join me to thank our panelists, Ambassador Marcel Wahba and Dr. Farah Jan, for this fruitful conversation. And I want personally to thank them also. I think we have a 10-minute break. Then we'll followed by our final panel, which is the new Middle East perspective from the region. So Mr. Borsalam will be a speaker, and also Dr. Ian Lustig. So thank you, everyone.
And now we'll be moving to the third and last panel that will focus on the new Middle East perspectives from the region, which will be moderated by Ilyas Al-Hosani, Deputy Chief of Media Sector in Trends Research and Advisory. Ilyas.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Ilyas Al-Hosani, and it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome you all to the third session titled The New Middle East, Perspectives from the Region. Many important factors characterize the new Middle East. These factors include cultural diplomacy, the people-to-people connections, the role and importance of the youth, economic development and integration, and finally, security interdependence. In a region driven by war and conflict, never before has cultural diplomacy been this important. Through culture, we can bridge the gaps and build a new Middle East with a brand new spirit and identity, I believe. Based on the people-to-people connections that we have witnessed, cultural diplomacy is now more important and could lead to or contribute to building sustainable peace and development in the Middle East. The cultural outgrowths of the normalization of the ties between the Arab countries and Israel is a positive indicator for the likelihood of an emerging new Middle East. In fact, one of the most significant achievements of the Abraham Accords, in my opinion, is the opportunity for academic collaborations between universities and research centers in the Arab countries and Israel. I believe such collaborations can enhance these people-to-people connections, as well as economic and governmental cooperation. However, these collaborations do not receive the required attention in the media today. I would also like to highlight the role of education in breaking down the long-held biases and the misinformed taboos across societies and by all ages. Education is now a bridge to a better future and a milestone towards mutual success and progress. In addition, I strongly believe out of my personal experience that the youth can be the bridge for a better future, either through their new values or cultural diplomacy. Fortunately, the Accords have created a new culture in the Accords countries, which can also reflect on the growing people-to-people connections that we witness today. Economic integration initiatives and projects in the region are also crucial to bringing out the vision of the new Middle East. In the region, which is lagging behind all parts of the world when it comes to economic cooperation, is ripe for such initiatives. However, any economic vision for the region would be incomplete without considering the present political and military situation. And this, to me, is the next factor that plays an important role in the reshaping and the new Middle Eastern identity, which is the negative security interdependence in the region. Regional negative security interdependence is influenced by the prevailing patterns of enmity between people and governments across the region and the unsolved regional conflicts, most notably the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. This is why I believe that complete and final conflict resolution must be achieved prior to efforts at reconciliation order for the latter to succeed. Our distinguished speakers today are going to offer insights on the factors that may shape the new Middle East and the challenges that face any vision of the new Middle East and the new opportunities it may bring out. Our first speaker for today, I would like to introduce Dr. Paul Salem, the president of the Middle East Institute. Prior to joining the MEI, Dr. Paul was the founding director of the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut between 2006 and 2013. Dr. Salem's areas of interest on issues of political change, transition, and conflict, as well as regional and international relations at the Middle East. The floor is yours, Dr. Paul.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Trends and to the Middle East Center here at University of Pennsylvania for hosting us. There's already been a lot said in the previous panels on the Middle East, changes in the Middle East, the new Middle East. So I hope to add a few perspectives in my opening remarks and then look forward to a conversation. I would start by saying there isn't the Middle East. It is several Middle Easts, in effect. When you look today, there certainly is a GCC, at least +3, but I would take it a different 3. There's GCC plus Jordan, Israel, Egypt, that are kind of coalescing into a certain direction. Some call them the moderate core, some call them the states that are also have very good relations with the United States. The developments that are happening in that Middle East are very important, and we can come back to some of them. Obviously, there's experiments, very successful ones in the UAE, now perhaps being emulated in Saudi Arabia, great changes taking place. The Abraham Accords are part of that. It might bring also a lot of progress and issues of technology, investment, education, public health, separate from the security and geostrategic issues which are there. Among that sort of group of countries, Egypt is the most challenging, the biggest country with the largest set of long-term problems in terms of population, but so far stable and with good relations, certainly with the Gulf countries, as well as Israel and the United States. The other Middle East obviously is more Iran-influenced, very chaotic, a sphere of influence that stretches from Yemen through Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. You can call almost all 4 of those semi-failed states. Each one has a very different condition, but that Middle East is in very dire conditions. Obviously, Yemen and Syria are in civil war of certain, it's a bit frozen right now, and there's some progress here and there, but failed states to some degree. Lebanon has collapsed economically, might potentially collapse further. And Iraq, despite its oil wealth and despite many advantages, is tearing itself apart and not able to move forward. And then you look further west, you have the countries of North Africa, which are really in a different, particularly Morocco and Algeria, almost in a different part of the Arab world. Yet they have their crises and their problems. Morocco and Algeria, high tension over the Western Sahara, but I would say have different pathways and are making some elements of progress. So it's a very disjointed Middle East. And then you have Turkey playing different games, and President Erdogan trying to secure his election next year, and doing a lot of moves, both in the regional sphere, but also in the Ukraine-Russia space. So the Middle East is actually multiple Middle Easts, and they're going in often very different directions. Also, when you look at the Middle East countries, the disparity is enormous. From completely failed states or areas with absolutely no governance whatsoever, which applies to parts of Yemen, parts of Syria, parts of Libya, to, again, the most hyper-advanced, maybe, which is the UAE, or other states which are strong, like Egypt, Israel, and others. So the Middle East cannot be generalized as one set of political conditions, nor can it be generalized in economic terms. Again, the Middle East hosts the poorest countries in the world and the richest countries in the world. So it's very difficult to grapple with all of this all at the same time. I would also say a number of countries, well, most of the region, and I would particularly focus on the Arab world, 100 years after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, is still struggling with basic issues. Like the nation. What should the nation be? Syria is tearing itself apart over that. Iraq is tearing itself. Libya, Yemen. The question of political community is greatly contested. The basic question of what a state should be. Should it be a monarchy? Should it be a democracy? Should it be secular? Should it be Islamic? Very fundamental issues. You don't see consensus throughout the Middle East or throughout the Arab world, nor do you see it in other parts of the Middle East for different reasons. The role of women, the place of women the empowerment of women is probably the singularly most important development of modern times for many reasons. And yet you see how that clashes with traditional norms, with certain interpretations of religion. You see today massive uprising in Iran over the issue of men dominating women, and it's not over. So this is a region that's going through a lot of sort of historical shifts and changes. Without touching on Israel, Turkey, and Iran, they too, Israel has its issues of what is Israel and is it secular, is it religious, who belongs, who doesn't belong. So very sort of profound issues. But if we jump to where we are, if you try to take an overview of the Middle East sort of today, 2022, you'd have to look at the impact of the COVID crisis. When you look at the hundreds of millions that live in the Middle East, the COVID, like in many other parts of the world, has been very difficult. It's caused increasing poverty, increasing income inequality, more vulnerability for women-led households, for marginalized groups, much tougher life for refugees and IDPs, put much more strain on the governments of the region who've had to spend a lot of money to keep things afloat economically, as well as respond in the public health situation. So trying to come out of the COVID-19 crisis was already a very huge burden for many of the countries. Again, exceptions. UAE is fine, Qatar is fine, Saudi Arabia is more fine than others because they have a lot of money. Then you add the double impacts of the Russian war on Ukraine, skyrocketing of energy prices and skyrocketing of food prices. So for many of the countries in the Middle East that go beyond the rich countries, it is a very, very difficult year. You see that in Iran, you see that in Morocco, in Egypt, in Jordan, let alone the poor people living in Yemen or Syria or Lebanon. All of the COVID and energy price and food price is really putting the region through an extreme stress test. It's hard to say if all the countries will survive, if there will be major shakeups or shifts or not. At the same time, however, the war in Ukraine and the rise in energy prices has shifted globally tremendous amounts of wealth to the Gulf, maybe up to $1.7 trillion if you look at it over a certain period of time. And the Gulf now has so much, not only wealth, but experience and capacity to do things and to lead at a time when neither the US has money or resources, certainly not Europe. China's not interested, certainly Russia is not interested, that it might be time for the region to start helping itself. The Abraham Accords obviously is a good aspect of that. Gulf support to Egypt is part of it as well. But I do think, as speaking of somebody originally from Lebanon, from the region, it's time that the region begins to coalesce as a region, as you were discussing, and begins, rather than looking to the US or looking to Europe or looking to the outside for particularly social economic help, it has the wherewithal to do it. There have been initiatives that have been tabled in the GCC, tabled at the meetings with President Biden in the GCC +3 in Saudi Arabia. There's going to be another meeting of the GCC +3 on Friday at 8 a.m. in New York. So we hope to see progress there. But there's a lot of potential for the region beginning to take care of itself. I will end with a note that you mentioned as well. What gives one hope about the region, it's both a challenge and a hope. The challenge is there's a lot of young people, so you have to find jobs, and that's not easy. But the positive side is there are a lot of young people and they have amazing energy, amazing capacity. They're not stuck in the past. And we see initiatives from Morocco all the way through to Oman and the UAE and Saudi Arabia and in Egypt, where younger people are charting a new course for their societies, for the economies, and for the region in general. You see it certainly in Iran with the protests today. So I would end with a note of cautious hope that the region has a lot of potential, but there's a lot of work to be done. Thank you.
I would like now to introduce our second speaker for today, Dr. Ian Lustig. Whom is a professor emeritus and holds the Bess W. Heyman Chair in the Political Science Department of the University of Pennsylvania. His present research focuses on the politics of Jewish and non-Jewish migration into and out of Palestine, prospects for peace between Israelis and Palestinians, applications of agent-based modeling in the social sciences, and the problem of modeling political violence.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I've enjoyed what I've been able to hear. I was sorry I wasn't able to be here for all the first session. Let me follow up on Paul's comment that it's time that perhaps the region help itself. That actually ties in very nicely with the general question of the United States' attitude toward the region. There's a tone here, one might say, is why doesn't the United States pay more attention to us? They should pay more attention to us. They should be. Well, the United States is a superpower. And superpowers are not super because they know a lot. They're super because they're enormous. And they can't focus their attention on very many things at the same time and use all their power to do so. There's only two circumstances in which a superpower like the United States pays a lot of attention to a region of the world. One is that there's a vital security interest being threatened there. The other is it intersects with domestic politics. Well, we saw what happened when in the end of the Cold War, the end of the 1990s, the war in Iraq was triggered in part by the absence of security threats to the United States, a superabundance of power that allowed slogans about democratizing the whole region and bringing an end to terrorism. It could become what the Bush administration thought would be a winning political issue for a generation. That was a catastrophe for the United States and several catastrophes for the Middle East. And that means that there is no domestic political reason for the United States to be deeply involved in the Middle East now. Nor is there a vital security interest. In fact, quite the opposite. We have vital security interests, threatened tactical nuclear weapon war in Ukraine. That's got our attention. Think of a superpower as a kind of dinosaur with a huge body and a small brain. And it gets distracted by indigestion, that is, its domestic politics, but also by something that might be a real threat, but it can only handle one or two things at a time. Well, that's Taiwan and that's Ukraine. That's not the Gulf, because, like it or not, Iran is not seen by the United States as a mortal threat to us. In fact, I think many American specialists believe that it's been hyped for various reasons as a threat. But let me now move from those observations about why that's the other side of the coin of the Middle East ought to look out for itself, because it's not going to get the United States to do it in the next 5, 10 years or even more. I would like to try to put this era of the Middle East into a kind of historical context and political context. And there are three things going on that I want to set out first before I make 5 points. One is, and I've already mentioned it, Ukraine. And I mentioned it in my question. Do not underestimate the extent to which that ongoing war can define American politics and American views of who is for us and who is against us on the planet. And especially if there is the kind of terrible energy crisis in Europe and rising costs of energy in the United States this winter, we don't know. But that's number one, that's distracted the dinosaur. The other one is China. not Russia so much, but China as a direct threat to American interests in the Pacific, where a Taiwan war could erupt at any moment. That is not something that we fear in the Middle East. It is something the United States is focused on. The pivot is real in that sense. Finally, in my list of three, it is something that we haven't discussed about Israel-Palestine. There have been several references to it, but the really important fact about that for the discussion of Middle East-US relations is the one-state reality. The fact that diplomatic opportunities based on any kind of partition negotiations or two-state solution are impossible and known to be so, privately, if not publicly, by all those diplomats who are serious and by the overwhelming majority of scholars and experts throughout the world. So pay no attention to what is said about the Abraham Accords as a way to preserve or the two-state solution from threatened Israeli annexation. That is a fraudulent claim. There already has been annexation, it just hasn't been legally enforced. And that might be a step forward as far as the long-term struggle for equality, but that's another story, and one in which I think the Abraham Accords play, in the long run, an important role. But because there is no political horizon for negotiations and diplomacy, the United States is freed from having to keep embarrassing itself with carry initiatives. And that is another reason why we are not involved in the Middle East, because of course, Israel is a crucial domestic political issue in the United States, and it's removed because of the absence of opportunities for diplomacy. Now, that one-state reality has also had an effect on the Arab world, which is not often named, and that is this. The Arab world, starting with the Saudi peace plan, going all the way back to the Arab Peace Initiative, and even further back, has gone to the United States to get what it wanted and what it needed from Israel on the Palestine question. They have kept going to the United States to get what they needed from Israel, and they failed, constantly failed, for the reason that the dinosaur cares much more about domestic political domestic politics, than any particular little dispute among foreigners over in the Middle East. So since the Arab world finally figured out that it cannot get from Israel what it wants by going to the United States, it goes to Israel to get what it wants from the United States. If UAE wants weapons, it makes peace with Israel. If Morocco wants the Western Sahara, it does what Israel wants: security cooperation and diplomacy. If Sudan wants to be removed from the terrorist list, it knows what to do. It goes to Israel, and so on. That is done because the OSR, the one-state reality, means there's no diplomatic option anyway, and the Arab world understands that the domestic politics is Trump in the United States. I don't mean Donald Trump. I mean it's Trump as over any other suit. So that one-state reality pushes the Arab world into the Abraham Accords. It's the one-state reality that is the reason for the Abraham Accord. Now, that's my introduction. How shall we think of this era? You know, I didn't hear one time the word non-alignment, but for old people like me, that's a world that you associate with the Middle East in the 1950s and 60s, non-alignment. You have two large blocks facing each other and competing for outlying regions that are not organized any longer under CETO or CENTO or the Baghdad Pact. And so Nasser and Tito and Sukarno and other leaders, and Nkrumah, look to see if they can be a non-aligned bloc and play off the great powers, superpowers, against one another. Well, in a way, that is what we are in now. There's a logic to why UAE and the other GCC states did not do what I suggested they should do when I asked my question. That is, act like allies, the United States, when NATO interests are threatened, because they are effectively gravitating toward a non-aligned situation. Even while in settings like this, they may say, we are your allies. That non-alignment, however, is different than it was then. What did you have in the 50s and 60s in the Arab world? You had mobilization regimes, Nasserist, Ba'athist, socialist, regimes that wanted to engage and mobilize the masses in politics. Maybe not through fair democratic elections, but they wanted mass participation in politics. And they had ambition to transform the entire region under their flag, whether it was going to be Egyptian-led, Iraqi-led, Ba'athist-led, or socialist. That's not what you have anymore. Now you have a Middle East that, although it's moving in this non-aligned position, taking this non-aligned position, you're not populated by mobilizational regimes that want to engage and mobilize their masses into politics. They don't want to do that. They're afraid of their populations. If you look at the polling, you can see on the Abraham Accords, for example, how drastically different the opinions of the masses in the Middle East are to what their actions and policies of their governments. That's just one. You could also look really at the same gulf when it comes to attitudes toward freedoms of assembly, freedoms of speech, and democratic or human rights. So what we have instead is a Middle East, which is a kind of club of authoritarian regimes, including Israel. Israel is part of the club. It's not a democratic country. If you consider democracy to be equal opportunities for all who live in the country to voice their concerns and participate in government. Because I include the West Bank and Gaza as within Israel right now as a state. So you've got a very interesting new situation that's also old. It's old in that the Middle East has been returned to an area, one region of the world, not the crucial region of the world. And it's up for grabs, and it gravitates toward a non-aligned position. China and Russia, even in polls among the masses, China is admired more than the United States in certain ways for its capacities as a effective government and for its economic programs, not for its civic and political stances. Now, there is one exception in the Middle East to this picture of a club of authoritarian regimes out to protect one another, out to protect each other from their constituents, okay? And that is Iran. I know Iran's not an Arab country, but it's a Middle Eastern country, as we all know, and it is a mass mobilization regime. It is a regime that, at least in principle, wants to transform the region. It does aspire to regional, to be a great power in the region, if not one of the two dominant players, the other one being Israel. That's its objective. It is more comparable to Nasser or the early Ba'athists than anyone else in the Middle East today. It refuses to cooperate with Israel for that reason. It is honoring, it's in line with what its masses believe, what its population wants. But there's a certain self-limiting aspect to Iranian ambitions because they're Shia, not Sunni. And they're Islamic in a fundamentalist sense that the Middle East, most of it has passed beyond. It's not attractive as a model. Those two factors, plus the fact that they're Iranian and speak Farsi and not Arab, limit their ability to really expand as a state the way Nasser or even Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi in his maddest moments thought expansion was possible. So there is, I believe, what we have in store in the, what I call strategic time, that is 5 to 10 years, is a period of ultra stability. It is a kind of balance of power situation in the region, where the region is located within a geopolitical framework that is multipolar, three poles basically, and moving in toward a vague non-aligned position. In that strategic time, and when I say strategic time, I mean to distinguish that between two other kinds of time. One is sports time, which is what most politics is discussed in. Who won, who lost, what's happening tomorrow, who made a mistake, what's the tactical embarrassment that just occurred, or should we consider the counteroffensive as successful or not in Kharkiv? That's all sports. Strategic time is what can happen as a consequence of policies now in 2 to 5 years, and what might the unintended results of those be. But the really important consequences of politics you only see in geologic time, which I consider anything 15 years or more. So when a great power intervenes in the Middle East, it thinks it's won a great victory in the first 100 days, but 15 years later, it turns out that the catastrophes that were associated with that outweigh by a factor of 100 any particular victory it might have thought it had in the first 100 days. So when we look at geologic time, look longer down the road. In strategic time, there's no opportunities for transformation, not through war and not through diplomacy. This is a period of ultra stability, meaning wars here or there, little conflicts, little clashes, lots of sports activity, but not very much change. But lurking in the background, and what will come in geologic time is another Arab Spring. That's one thing that will come. The other thing that will come is a process of partly violent, partly peaceful, partly normal democratization in Israel-Palestine, in which the Arab world, integrated into Israel through the Abraham Accords, will play a crucial role. Now, that's hard for it to do now, since all the governments involved are not democratic. But that's not the way things will, but those governments will be transformed precisely because they don't have strong links to their masses. But that's geologic time. That's 15, 20 years. I won't be here anymore to see whether I am right or not, but many of you will be. So thank you.
Thank you. We'll move forward to the Q&A session, but before I ask any questions, I'll leave the floor to the audience. Is there any question that the audience wants to ask these distinguished speakers? No? Okay, I'll start off my first question, which is directed to Dr. Paul. You mentioned earlier this year that there is an increasing awareness of the need to turn away from decades of geopolitical concentration and focus on the common systemic issues faced by the societies of this region in a challenging century. How do you believe we could achieve this?
Well, I would base that also on, as Dr. E had mentioned, public opinion polls and what people want. In opinion surveys throughout the Middle East, including Iran and Turkey, people want jobs, human security, good public health, the basic things of life. The Arab uprisings, the uprising today in Iran, the uprisings in Turkey are not ideological. They don't want to conquer new territories. They don't want to raise other issues. They want improvement in their lives. That is important to keep in mind because that's a driving force. I think that you've seen in a number of Arab governments, not all of them, but a number of them, a recognition that that is what needs to be focused on. Now, that's being done within an authoritarian framework. That's true. But there's been tremendous attention to the things that impact human security, advances in economics, in education, in technology, empowering young people in the private sector and in business, the government stepping up to provide better public health and to do its job. The challenge there, as I mentioned, is the capacity of the governments. Other than the rich governments, their capacities are limited, and they're getting more limited because of the pressures of COVID, energy, and food. And many of these countries are on the brink of explosion because of that. Alongside this challenge of trying to focus on human security needs, is how do you manage that politically? And unfortunately, the attempts at democratization in some of the Arab countries after the Arab Spring either led to civil war in some cases, like in Libya and Syria, because they were prevented from moving forward, or they have been reversed, like in Tunisia or Sudan. The two countries that, limp forward in a semi-democratic format are in miserable shape. Those are Iraq and Lebanon. That gives a very bad example of what a democratic system can and should be. It doesn't help that the US system is going through the worst periods of modern times, not giving an example of good leadership, certainly in the, be specific, in the previous administration, nor an image that democracy is good for the nation. Democracy is dividing the nation and almost leading to civil war. And at a time when, we're mourning the passing of Queen Victoria, it's only the monarchies in the Arab world. Sorry, did I say Victoria? That's been a while. Elizabeth II, to be precise. It's only the monarchies that are sort of managing in the Middle East. But I worry about that. I worry about that as a long-term trajectory for the Arab world in particular, because monarchies and authoritarian systems can be very effective and very stable in the short and medium term. But like you see in Russia, and like you see in Iran, and like you see in other places, I don't know if it's exactly in the geological time, but if you measure dictatorships or authoritarian system over 30 or 40 years, they don't have a good long-term sustainability. I do think that it's, as I indicated, that now that the region has the resources, it is an opportunity as well as an obligation for the region to take care of itself on at least the human security level. It still remains the case that in terms of sort of security in the traditional sense, the region doesn't produce or have the capacity to do that. Its main relationships still are with the United States. As Ambassador Wahbi says, neither Russia nor China are options. That remains the case. I agree with Dr. Lustig that it is a slightly non-aligned moment, but it's a non-aligned moment even while all of these countries are getting all of their security protection and so on from one party, which is really still the United States. And that's an interesting situation. Thank you.
The second question could be for Dr. Lustig. For the past decade, many of the GCC states lost confidence in the US as the security guarantor and consequently built closer ties with Washington's global competitors, which are Russia and China. Do you believe we need a new agreement or contract for the US-GCC relationship?
Well, the logic of what I was saying is that I don't think that this is the time for a formalized agreement. If that that the logic of the situation is that the Middle East, especially the GCC, will try to move toward non-alignment. Now, to the extent to which they are really afraid of the Iranians, to which they really are afraid, and to the extent that their populations might succeed in dissuading them from maintaining as close relationships with Israel as the elites in those countries seem to want, they may want to get the United States to be more explicit about its commitments. But I think the United States is in a position to drive a relatively hard bargain when that, because it doesn't need them. If the Middle Eastern oil-rich states are not prepared to help the United States when it really needs their help, well, other solutions will be found. But this is a test, in my view, for the Gulf. It's not so much a test for the United States. The United States will accommodate itself to the fact that there will be no negotiated Israeli-Palestinian peace. In fact, it's a lot easier for administrations not to constantly be subject to demands to do something diplomatically, which they cannot do for domestic political reasons anyway. It's a relief. So the United States can more or less easily de-escalate its ties to the Middle East. And as was pointed out, Middle Easterners don't really want to end up in the arms of the Chinese or the Russians. So it is, I may be sounding more like a player in this game of who's going to get the support of the non-aligned world. But it seems to me that it's really up to the GCC, if it wants to regularize its relationships with the United States, and formalize it, have a new understanding. It's got to step up and say, yeah, and we are with you. It's hard for them to do that because the flag that's being raised is a democratic one. Or to be a little more specific, because as Paul pointed out, democratic experiments in the Middle East have not been very successful. But the real distinction that I was making is not so much democracy versus autocracy as those regimes which include the mobilization of their mass populations in governance, in politics, as opposed to exclude and demobilize the populations. Iran is an example of a regime that mobilizes its population. And that's risky for the elite because it has to keep in line with what the passions it arouses, which is why many traditional elites, monarchical elites, don't want to do that. But in the long run, that's where the power of a state comes from. And those are considerations and trade-offs which the GCC leaders will have to be making in the next 5 to 10 years.
In your opinion, would the new chapter of Israel's relations with the Arab world resemble the new Middle East of Shimon Peres of 1993?
So let's talk about that. So you may not know that when Israel was founded, the Hebrew University started producing this journal called HaMizrach HaKadash, the New Middle East, the New East. And you might also not know that in the late 60s, the Israeli Foreign Ministry and Mossad secretly funded a journal out of London called The New Middle East, which featured Palestinian moderates who wanted a two-state solution, but were maybe anti-PLO. It was closed by Abba Eban in 1972 because it got a little too enthusiastic about the two-state solution. That was also the New Middle East. Then, as you mentioned, Shimon Peres in the 1990s, after the Madrid, trying to make Madrid something that never was real by calling it the beginning of the New Middle East, which was nothing. And then, of course, the phrase became somewhat popular associated with the Iraq War and with George Bush. Democracy in the whole Middle East. We'll have a new Middle East. So now you have Tony Blair talking sort of the same way about how wonderful things are happening all over the Middle East, the new Middle East. To me, it's the oldest thing in the Middle East to talk about a new Middle East. And to me, it's important to see, well, what is different about this new Middle East? What is different about this old, new Middle East? And I try to point out how the regime type is standardly in the Middle East is so different now than it was in the 50s and 60s, even though many of the other contextual factors are the same.
Dr. Paul, do you have any input on this?
Well, I mean, I don't think the relations between Israel and particularly the Gulf countries and Morocco herald a new Middle East in some major way. I agree with Dr. Lustig. I think that's that label is overdone. The Middle East is in flux. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of good stuff going on, and there's 4 countries that have completely collapsed, 3 ongoing civil wars, the highest refugee ratio in the world, the highest IDP ratio in the world. So I wouldn't call it sort of the new Middle East. I would rather be more, gray and realistic and say there's tons of human security problems that matter to the people of this region, that at least the Gulf countries, which now have the capacity, they're doing well themselves. It's an opportunity for them to stand with others through that mechanism, create a new Middle East in the sense that it's working to take care of its own problems and is not dependent on outside countries, whether it's the US or tomorrow China, to fix its problems for it. And that's the only stable way to build a future, is organize yourself. I do think that Iran is in a very difficult player in this. I mean, you know, Iranian, and when you see it today in the protests, you saw it in the protests in 2019, protests back in 2009, that the choice, the ideological choices that the regime has made, it is now clashing with a population, most of which certainly wasn't alive during the time of the Shah, wasn't even alive during the Iran-Iraq war. They just want to live their lives. But the regime insists in continuing to impose a strict religious view and continuing to pursue an expansionist, interventionist foreign policy in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, a death to Israel, death to the United States. If people want to get on with their lives, and I think that's in a way the biggest question mark to the future of the Middle East, because I find Iran to be probably the most, in the longer term, the most unstable. I can imagine Turkey after Erdogan, there'd be another, you know, prime minister, another president, life will go on. I can imagine most of these countries not changing fundamentally, but Iran risks, but maybe it's a good thing, to change fundamentally and then relieve a lot of the very difficult conditions for the Iranians themselves. Iran should be a far more advanced, prosperous, happy place. It is mired in, you know, religious, dark, combative view. It's a very complex situation in Iran, but it really casts a long shadow across the Middle East. Well, let me end there.
I'm going to ask a question that many ask. Do you think other countries in the MENA region will fall and join the Abraham Accords?
You have any in particular in mind that haven't? But that's not fair to ask you that question. Let me answer. If what I said is true, then you ought to, the ones that should join the Abraham Accords would be those that want something from the United States that they can't otherwise get. Just like the Moroccans wanted the Western Sahara and they wanted the blessing of the United States on that. So if you see a Middle Eastern country that hasn't yet joined the Abraham Accords, it probably means that they don't have something that they want from the United States that badly. Saudi Arabia might be a good example. So that would be the conditions under which you'll get more people signing those kinds of agreements, because what the Abraham Accords are not one big treaty that everybody's signing. It's a series of separate side deals, replete with side payments, bribes coming from the United States to pay the Middle Eastern countries to make peace with Israel. That's what's happened. So the question is, who needs a bribe? And I don't really see anybody now that hasn't already taken it about to jump to do it. But who knows? That's what you would look at. Yeah? Do they have something to gain from the United States that they can't get without going to Israel? I don't know.
I'm going to keep the floor again to the audience. Is there any question that I'd like to ask? Go ahead.
Thank you. My question to Dr. Ian. Main regional power like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel, Egypt, even Turkey, working now to rebuild their relationship to avoid more collapsing in the region and face the many challenges, including Iran challenge. At the same time, United States moving to sign an agreement with Iran, mainly will give Iran more power in the region. So how you can explain this situation from United States? Another question to Dr. Baul Salim. You talk and mention about the collapsing in many Arab countries in the region and many conflict inside the region. When we talk about the new Middle East era, this country situation, to what extent they will continue like this? And if America reduce their, United States reduce their presence in the region, do you expect more competition between the regional power inside the region, especially in these countries? Thank you.
So quickly to respond, historically, if you have very, very powerful countries, large populations, a coherent and strong political apparatus joined to that, and a very effective military force, and next to it are relatively weak but extremely wealthy small population countries, that's a recipe for expansion. Okay, historically throughout human history, you would expect that. So there's no question that there's going to be an expansion, a desire for some kind of influence by Iran, that it be a dominant player in the Middle East. That's not going to change. If there's an international order to which the states of the world abide, that honors existing boundaries, that's the best security for those Gulf states. That existed pretty well until the Ukraine war. That's the thing that the war in Ukraine challenges. Of course, the United States invasion of Iraq helped challenge that also, no question about it. But there is a feeling among many in the United States that Iran is not, has its place as a great power in the Middle East. The nuclear question is odd to many Americans because everybody knows that Israel has nuclear weapons. So why wouldn't Iran have nuclear weapons also? Or if Israel has nuclear weapons, isn't that for the purpose of deterring a war by other states like Iran? So what's the big deal? Seems to many that the real problem that many see in Iran is not a threat of nuclear war, but that Iran will be a country that is a major player in the region, constantly putting pressure on others and in support of its proxies. And I don't think there's a way around that. So what that leads to is a kind of containment posture with which the agreement with Iran is perfectly consistent. And I think that's why America will eventually sign one with Iran, that the West will, even if it's up and down every week, whether it's about to be signed. And finally, I'll say that there's a lot of annoyance in the United States with an Israeli position that is constantly demanding military action when they have nuclear weapons. Everybody, and we know that, they know that. We have to pretend we don't know it or aid gets cut off, but that it means that there's no real danger of nuclear war. What there is a danger of from the Israeli point of view is that Israel will not be able to use conventional force at will and virtually no cost in Syria or Lebanon or Gaza. If there's another country in the region that has nuclear weapons, and theoretically there could be escalation, that's what Israel doesn't want. And it's playing, the United States, Americans know the extent to which they're being played, and they don't like that. That's not in the public debate. The nuclear capacity in Israel is completely absent from 99% of all discussions of the nuclear question when it comes to Iran. And what I would suggest is you think, why is that? Even though everybody knows it's true, why is it never discussed? And that chain of thinking will lead you to many insights that you would want to have if you want to understand what the situation really is between the United States, Israel, and the Middle East.
On the question, I mean, I look at the Arab countries in particular as four kinds of states. There's the hyper successful states, hyper strong, doing very well. There is the reasonably stable Morocco's, even Egypt and so on. Then there's the very fragile states. Lebanon is obviously one. And then there's states that are effectively in different stages of state collapse or civil war. The top tier of those countries are doing fine. The hyper-successful don't need help, don't need attention. The middle ones, the Moroccos and the Egypts, can benefit from standard interaction like investment and trade and sort of not things that are not very difficult or very exceptional. The fragile states like Lebanon or like Iraq, I think, do need emergency particular attention in order that they don't completely collapse and become civil wars of their own. And then the civil war countries require politics, diplomacy, real action to get them out of civil war. 4 of those countries, which is Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, are effectively partially proxy wars with Iran. And I've been to Iran many times. I meet regularly with Iranian officials. The bottom line of the Iranians is they're willing to talk, but they're not willing to give up any of their proxy militias or having them armed or having them answering to. That's not on the table. So that makes that situation very difficult. That Iran, of course, is a major player and should be it's a major power in the region, but the rules by which it chooses to play, which it's not willing to discuss, which is largely weaponizing Shiite communities and arming them and so on, which then drives Sunni extremism. And they're not even willing to discuss that. That is a very destabilizing thing. The ideal would be to get Iran to play by normal rules of international relations and have a role in the region as a regional power. But I don't see that happening. So the best that can be done in the Yemens, the Syrias, the Lebanons, the Iraqs is a kind of truce, a kind of managing the crisis. And I think we've approached that. Yemen is much calmer today than it was 6 months ago. Syria is not an active war. It's kind of a frozen conflict. Lebanon is suffering economic problems, but not civil war. So I think that, touches to the bigger picture in terms of Iran. To my mind, there's no solution with the Islamic Republic. Their ideological position, the current situation of their internal politics, they're not going to change. So I think it is deterrence. It is kind of managing coexistence. I don't think Iran is interested in attacking Israel or doing anything in any major aggressive way, but neither is it willing to change the way it's doing things. So I think we're going to have to live with an Iran like this, using deterrence, using pushback here and there, but just accepting that this is the world we're going to be living in until something happens in Tehran domestically. Yeah. No, because it's uncontained. It's completely.
It sounds like Kennan talking about the Soviet Union.
No, I wouldn't call it. It would have been containment were they not already in, militarily present in Lebanon, militarily present in Syria and Iraq and Yemen. They are already, they're already out of the container, if you want to call it like that. I see it as some elements of coexisting, sort of, the Kissinger approach to coexisting with the Soviet Union. Let's not have a nuclear war. We're not going to change the Soviets overnight. Let's buy time. Maybe in a decade or 2 or 3, something else will emerge. Let's manage the situation. I think realistically, a nuclear deal with Iran would help manage the nuclear side. It will not lead to talks about Hezbollah and the Houthis, other than managing it. The Hezbollah will stay, Houthis will stay fully armed, Assad, the groups, and Syria, and so on. So I think we can talk about management, but there will be no breakthroughs with the Islamic Republic. Like there would have been no breakthroughs until there was change in Moscow. There will be no breakthrough until there's change in Iran. But definitely we shouldn't also have an escalation with Iran. That would be ruinous for everybody. So it's a matter of managing that situation. But I thank Trends again for this session, and thank everybody for being patient with us. And it's great to see you, Ian.
With that, I'd like to conclude today's session entitled The New Middle East Perspectives from the Region. And I also like to thank our distinguished speakers, the audience, and the e-viewers. Thank you very much.
The closing remarks will be delivered by Ibrahim Bakri, Assistant Director of the Middle East Center at the University of Pennsylvania.
Hello, everyone. I promise I'm going to keep this very short because I know that we've already gone over a little bit. So for those of you who've stuck around with us, we really appreciate it. Okay, so I think that I speak for all of us here when I say that this has been an incredibly informative conference. As the Middle East endeavors to reshape itself and reaffirm its identity, conversations like this are crucial and extremely timely. I want to begin by expressing my sincerest gratitude to Trends Research and Advisory for being such incredible partners. Working across time zones is never easy, but your staff's responsiveness and adaptability made it feel extremely straightforward. And I speak for the entire center when I thank you for making the long trip here to Philadelphia from Abu Dhabi. We hope that you've enjoyed your time on campus and at our university. And we look forward to continued collaboration between our institutions. While I'm on the topic, I'd also like to commend Trends for something that I've long admired, and that's its continued effort to nurture and support the voices of young, up-and-coming researchers. That mission is what connected me to Trends in the first place, and feels especially relevant here at a university setting. In an increasingly connected world, young minds have an astonishing ability to shape the world around them, and this is something that we're very familiar with here at Penn. Throughout this conference, we've touched repeatedly on the topic of change. And it's important to keep in mind that for policy researchers at the beginning of their careers, change is not some aberration to the norm. It's the one thing that we actually can depend on. We've been shaped by the central belief that a status quo, however rigid on the exterior, will inevitably shift. And during these shifts, we have the responsibility to establish an identity, hold tightly to our values, and embrace the potential that accompanies change. The belief that the best hope for our future, especially the future of policy, lies in the hands of the next generation defined the work of the late Dr. James McGann. And I'd like to thank Dr. Muhammad Al-Ali for his incredibly kind words at the beginning of the conference. Now, I'm going to summarize very, very quickly what we've heard today, and then we can get out of here. And please grab some coffee on your way out. But we've heard many thought-provoking comments. In our first panel, we discussed the region and new international balances. Now, as nations such as the United States begin to reevaluate their interests on the world stage, and domestic and regional actors act to expand their spheres of influence, the region has found itself participating in a very delicate balancing act, one with repercussions that can ripple across the world stage. I'd like to thank Dr. Sean Yom and Kenneth Katzman for their wisdom and thoughts. In the second panel, we discussed the future of the US-Gulf relationship, a topic that continues to gather attention here in the United States, even during a lull in general interest in the Middle East. From fraught contemporary relationships between the United States and Saudi Arabia during the Biden administration, to the efforts of nations like the UAE to strengthen and elevate their presence on the world stage, Ambassador Marcel Wahbe and Dr. Farah Jan helped set the stage of a rapidly evolving topic. In our last panel of the day, we shifted focus to perspectives on the region, framing contemporary changes as signifiers of a new Middle East, a title that may or may not be contentious in its own right. Now, as countries within the region begin moving away from external forces and start taking a more insular approach to democracy, the uplifting of voices from within the region and the encouragement of dialogue within the region itself is of utmost importance. From lack of faith in regional cooperation to the open wounds of foreign intervention and democratic experiments by the United States, to government actions that may or may not clash with public opinion, there's a great deal here to unpack. And I want to thank Dr. Ian Lustig and Dr. Paul Salem for addressing this vital topic so expertly. So thank you to our guests, both in person and remotely, for being here with us today. Let's all continue to keep these conversations alive and hope for better days to come. Thank you all so much.